we've talked about this system before, is the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. And it's important that you differentiate the activities of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system is a higher system function, routine homeostatic adjustment. You know the term homeostasis. That's a comprehensive question. Homeostasis. But the homeostatic adjustment in physiologic symptoms is made in the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system coordinates cardiovascular, respiratory, digestive, urinary, and reproductive functions. Autonomic nervous system adjusts internal water, electrolyte, nutrients, dissolved gases, concentration of body fluids, so without instructions or interference from the conscious mind. This system works by remote control. We don't have to do anything for the autonomic nervous system to be able to work. It integrates systems of autonomic activity located in the hypothalamus. Neurons in these centers are comparable to upper motor neurons. So this is considered the visceral motor neurons in the brainstem, the spinal cord. The axons of these neurons, these preganglionic neurons, are called preganglionic fibers. They leave the central nervous system, will make synapses at various areas of the body. Ganglionic neurons innervate visceral effector cells such as cardiac muscle, smooth muscles, glands, and adipose tissue. This is where the autonomic nervous system is going to work. You should be familiar with this. Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands and adipose tissue. There are somatic and visceral sensory information that trigger visceral responses. There are motor commands. So commands that we see coming from our spinal nerves innervate somatic muscles. But when we talk about visceral muscles, the smooth muscles of the cardiac system, smooth muscles of blood vessels, smooth muscles of organs, such as the gastrointestinal tract, these are all innervated by the ganglionic or postganglionic fibers of the autonomic nervous system. Now, we see motor commands control activities of target organs. But when we see in cold weather, the autonomic nervous system would automatically say, stimulate the hair on the back of our neck to raise. It would automatically increase our heart rate, would automatically cause the pores in our skin to contract. This is all done by the autonomic nervous system. We don't have to consciously think to make this system work. The changes in visceral activity occur in response to release of neurotransmitters, which we'll touch upon in just a little bit. So two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. You need to know parasympathetic and sympathetic. Sympathetic division and parasympathetic. Most often the two systems have opposing effect. The sympathetic nervous system causes excitation, where we'll see the parasympathetic nervous system causes inhibition. Two divisions may work together, or they may work independently depending on what activity they're going to carry out. Let's see, I missed the test question. Okay. Now, sympathetic nervous system. In general, sympathetic nervous system kicks it in. It's the system that during periods of exertion, stress, or in an emergency, this system is going to kick into effect. It will predominate. The parasympathetic nervous system predominates when you're at rest. So we'll see the parasympathetic nervous system take effect when the person is sleeping. That's why we see most digestion takes place when we're sleeping, because we don't need activity in our skeletal muscles at that time, so we don't need any voluntary control of muscle. The autonomic nervous system, dominated by the parasympathetic nervous system, when we're at rest, will take effect, and so most digestion occurs. So predominantly in the digestive system, the parasympathetic nervous system takes effect. But if we have to run from an emergency, flight or fight type of response, or if we're going to fight, we increase our heart rate, our bronchial tubes will dilate, our pupils will dilate. Why? Because we want as much air in as we can, because we may have to run. We want our eyes to dilate. We want to be able to see where we're going. And so when the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, that's our fight or flight response. So we're excited. But when we're at rest, parasympathetic, digestion takes place, and parasympathetic, dominated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic division, the thoracolumbar division, preganglionic fibers from the thoracic and the superior lumbar segment of the spinal cord, synapsing the ganglia and the spinal nerve. The sympathetic division, in this division of the autonomic nervous system, we see the fibers of the autonomic nervous system. Preganglionic fibers are short, postganglionic fibers are long. This is just basically where the nerves come off. There's actually a point of communication. Interneurons will communicate, and there'll be another long axonal fiber. So the first portion, preganglionic, short. Second portion, long. It's not a test question. I was just trying to explain. Sympathetic division prepares the body for a heightened level of somatic activity. So when you're going to need that extra energy, you're going to need that, and again, the term flight or fight, you need that extra energy. It's the sympathetic nervous system that's going to be kicking in. An increase in sympathetic activity generally stimulates tissue metabolism and increases alertness. Sympathetic activity should be able to recognize these on a test question. General pattern of responses for sympathetic activity: heightened mental alertness, increased metabolic rate, reduced digestive and urinary function. Think about it. Sympathetic activation means that we need somatic muscle. Could care less whether or not you can absorb carbohydrates right now. You need to be able to run. So you need your energy into your skeletal muscles. So again, digestive and urinary functions. Now, some may say when you're scared enough and something really scares you, you pee in your pants. And so you think that's a sympathetic innervation, but it's actually not. Sympathetic nervous system is actually taking all that away. That's a parasympathetic response. Is urination, I will digress here for a second, is that a learned response or is that an autonomic response? Do you learn not to pee in the bed? Yeah, you have this a learned response. So it's one of the areas where we kind of, our mental consciousness kind of takes over. Because as a baby, you know, we pee in on everything. But as you get a little bit older, you learn you just can't pee in your shorts all the time, okay? So it's a learned response. So increased respiratory rate, also a part of the sympathetic activity, dilation of respiratory passageways. Think about it. If you're going to run, you want your passageways to dilate. You want to be able to breathe real good. So sympathetic stimulation, bronchial dilatation, increased heart rate, increased blood vessel, activation of sweat glands. Remember, you're running, you're sweating. So when you think about it, it all makes sense. Sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight response. That's what happens. Parasympathetic division, craniosacral division. The other one was thoracolumbar. Now we're craniosacral division. Preganglionic fibers originate from the brain. Sacral segments to the spinal cord. The synapses of the ganglia are very close or within the target organ, whereas the other one was short and long. This one is almost right within the target organ. Parasympathetic activity division stimulates the visceral activity, for example, responsible for the state of rest and repose. After a big dinner, what do you want to do? You want to go to sleep. Blood flow gets diverted to the GI tract. Little blood gets shunted away from the brain. You get a little bit sleepy, and digestion can take place because you ate that big meal. You don't need any sympathetic stimulation going on at that time. You need to be able to digest food. Parasympathetic innervation takes away that alertness that you need because you're not about to fight, you're not about to run, you're about to go to sleep. So parasympathetic innervation. So it promotes sedentary activities such as digestion. Overall pattern of response: decreased metabolic rate, decreased heart rate, blood pressure, increased secretions of salivary secretions such as amylase, lipase in the digestive system. Digestive glands will go into effect. Increased motility and blood flow in the digestive tract. Blood gets diverted from the brain and you get sleepy. So that's why you get sleepy after you eat a meal. Stimulation of urination and defecation. Parasympathetic responses. Now, there's another system that's thrown in there that I don't go into a lot of detail about called the enteric nervous system. It's also a part of the autonomic nervous system, but we won't go into much detail about it. It also includes the third division where most people never have heard of it, enteric nervous system, an extensive network of neurons and nerves networked together located in the walls of the digestive tract. Its activity in the enteric nervous system influenced by sympathetic and parasympathetic division, many complex visceral reflexes, coordinated and initiated, and goes on there. It has roughly 100 million neurons, This is just a side note if you ever play Trivial Pursuit. The enteric nervous system has roughly 100 million neurons, at least as many as the spinal cord, all neurotransmitters found in the brain. So, autonomic nervous system, ANS in summary. Nervous system operates largely outside of conscious awareness. We don't really tell ourselves, okay, I got to increase my heart rate right now because I'm going to. You don't think like that. This happens automatically. Sympathetic division, concerned with increasing alertness, metabolic rate, and our muscular abilities. Parasympathetic division, concerned with reducing metabolic rate and promoting visceral activities such as digestion. Sympathetic division consists of preganglionic neurons that are located between T1 and L2 of the spinal cord. Then the cell bodies of these preganglionic neurons are situated in the lateral gray horns, which, if we have time, I'll go into a little more detail about. But this is just an illustration off the out of your textbook that shows you the sympathetic nerves, where they'll go. The organs are almost identical to what you're going to see when I put up the one for the parasympathetic division: eyes, salivary glands, heart, lungs, liver, stomach, digestive tract, because there is a signal has to go to the sympathetic nervous system to tell it to shut off. There are connections for the sympathetic nerves to go, referred to as ganglions. The neurons in the ganglia control the effect at the target organs in the thoracic cavity and in the head and in the limbs. I won't go into a lot of details about that. The adrenal glands, the center of each of the adrenal glands, the area known as the adrenal medulla, is a modified sympathetic ganglion. Now, in the adrenal medulla, if you recall, in the endocrine system, in the adrenal medulla, that is where we'll see epinephrine, norepinephrine are being produced at. It's very important because the release of neurotransmitters from this area into capillaries, not at the synapse, allows them to function as hormones that will affect target organs. Epinephrine, norepinephrine, think noradrenaline, adrenaline, same difference. These agents will increase activity, increase metabolic rate, increase heart rate, cause bronchial dilatation, cause your pupils to dilate. So important that there's communication between the neurotransmitters that are developed in the adrenal medulla, and its effect on the sympathetic nervous system. And there you'll see the communication between the adrenal medulla and the nervous system. Again, that neuroendocrine type of response that we can see takes place in the system. The sympathetic division, again, structures in the thoracic cavity, the head and neck. That's why this is referred to as the thoracolumbar segment. More sympathetic ganglion exists there. I already talked about sweat glands being affected by sympathetic division, where it's located at thoracolumbar region primarily. Sympathetic division, abdominal, pelvic, visceral, receive sympathetic innervation via sympathetic preganglionic. Now remember, even though the visceral organs are predominated by parasympathetic, remember parasympathetic is going to take care of digestion, information still has to go to the sympathetic nervous system. What happens if a crisis occurs and you have to divert the blood supply from the GI tract to the skeletal muscles? Okay, so communication has to exist. So it's not that there's no sympathetic innervation in digestive organs. You get sympathetic innervation to the digestive tract, what happens? The digestive tract slows down. It stops digesting food. So if the sympathetic system predominates in the GI tract, then the GI tract stops working. Shifts blood supply back to the brain, the skeletal muscles where you need the energy at. If the parasympathetic nervous system predominates, skeletal muscles will relax, you'll go to sleep, you'll rest. Innervation predominates in the GI tract. So the two systems work in coordination with each other. But if I asked you a question, sympathetic nervous system now predominates in the GI tract, what happens? Do you increase absorption? No, you don't, because sympathetic innervation. You're not going to do any absorption during that time. Do you increase gastric motility? No, you don't, because this sympathetic innervation, sympathetic information would slow down the processes that take place in the bowel tract. Would you see increased production of digestive enzymes? No, because sympathetic innervation, you got no digestion takes place. But if I said, oh, you decreased the amount of gastric acid secretion, you decreased bowel motility, then you knew that was a sympathetic innervation into the GI tract. Remember, parasympathetic makes the GI tract work, makes you go to sleep. Sympathetic innervation, excitation, use of skeletal muscles, conscious thought, bronchodilation, flight or fight type of response. General functional pattern, a reduction of blood flow and energy use by organs that are not important for short-term survival, i.e. the digestive tract. Short-term survival. Need the digestive tract for long-term survival. We need proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids, so we need the digestive system to work. But if we have to get out of the way of a falling building, we need sympathetic innervation. Could care less whether we're absorbing lipids right now. We need to be able to run, and that's what the sympathetic division will do. Splanchnic nerves innervate 3 of the ganglia that are involved in the sympathetic system. There are 3 primary ganglion that are named and that are associated with sympathetic division. The celiac ganglion, the superior mesenteric ganglia, and the inferior mesenteric ganglia. The names are derived because their approximation with the blood vessels that are associated with those regions. Celiac ganglion consists of a pair of interconnected masses of gray matter, But the celiac ganglion forms a single mass of many small interroving masses, fibers, nerve fibers that will innervate stomach, liver, gallbladder, pancreas, and spleen. Again, these are sympathetic divisions. These will not increase GI activity. This will slow it down. And then there's the superior mesenteric that will provide innervation to the stomach, small intestines, and pancreas. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because even though these 2 systems, parasympathetic dominates in the digestive system, I want you to appreciate the fact that it doesn't mean that the sympathetic nervous system, autonomic nervous system isn't there. It just doesn't cause increased activity in this area. Inferior mesenteric area goes to the large intestines and the other abdominal pelvic cavities, urinary bladder, sexual organs, kidneys. The adrenal medulla, again, is a modified sympathetic ganglion. The adrenal medulla, neuroendocrine cells exist here. Chemical messengers, neurotransmitters produced here. Most importantly, dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine are important chemical messengers. Because of the access to the bloodstream, these chemical messengers can be initiated and put right into the bloodstream. The neuroendocrine cells of the adrenal medulla will secrete neurotransmitters, epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine and adrenaline account for 75 to 80% of the secretory output. The rest is norepinephrine, okay, in the sympathetic division. So you need to be familiar with that. Adrenaline, in the name adrenaline, should give you the key. Epinephrine, adrenaline, norepinephrine or noradrenaline is the name. 75 to 80% of secretory output. Sympathetic division of bloodstream carries neurotransmitters throughout the body, causing changes in metabolic activity in different cells. Cells innervated by sympathetic postganglionic fibers are affected as well. Now, in the sympathetic division, when we see the products here, the effect is much longer than what we see produced by direct sympathetic innervation. Why? Because chemical substances that are secreted into the system have a longer effect. Nerves that turn on and turn off have very short bursts of energy, but when we see the neuroendocrine model, we can see the effect will last much longer than that produced by direct sympathetic innervation, because hormones will continue to diffuse out of the bloodstream over extended periods of time. Now, not that this is tremendously long. Epinephrine has a very short half-life. You administer it, you have to administer it 5 minutes later. But in comparison to just turning a nerve on and turning it off, it's a much longer effect than we see from direct innervation of a nerve. The sympathetic division can change activities of tissue and organ systems by releasing norepinephrine in peripheral synapses and disturbing epinephrine and norepinephrine throughout the body and the bloodstream. The sympathetic activation is controlled by the sympathetic center that's located in the hypothalamus, that you're already familiar with from the endocrine system. The effect is not limited to the peripheral tissue. Sympathetic activation alters central nervous system activity. And we've already gone over what happens in sympathetic innervation. Sympathetic division, already talked about There are the two types of receptors that will receive information from the sympathetic division: alpha receptors and beta receptors. These are basically G proteins. When you stimulate these receptors, it will depend upon the messenger and or the neurotransmitters that are being delivered. The stimulation of alpha receptors will activate specific enzymes inside the cell. We'll see similar processes take place when you see the activation of the beta receptors that are located in the membranes of the cells of many organs, such as skeletal muscles, lungs, hearts, and liver. And basically, remember where the signals are sent in the autonomic nervous system from the brain. They have a target organ. There have to be receptors that will respond to these various branches of the nervous system. So sympathetic nervous system, again, has beta receptors and alpha receptors. What you'll see in the parasympathetic nervous system are a different set of receptors referred to as muscarinic and nicotinic receptors, which I'll talk about here in just a second. And in the parasympathetic component, again, you see the organs are the same. You see the eyes, you see the smooth muscle glands, the salivary glands, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the GI system, but the effect on the target organs are different in the parasympathetic nervous system. Again, this is the system that's going to be for rest and repose. Again, there are ganglions, distal ganglions. Again, these ganglions exist closer or inside of the target organs themselves. In contrast to the comparison that we saw in the sympathetic nervous system, these ganglionic neurons are located in the same ganglions, or their postganglionic fiber influence the same target organs. The effect on the parasympathetic stimulation is more specific and localized than we saw in the parasympathetic division. Now, these are the ganglions that are responsible for that. The names don't correspond as so closely as you saw with the ganglions with the sympathetic nervous system, which were named close to the blood vessels which they course. But the ganglions, ciliary ganglions, I'm not testing you on this, otic ganglions, intramural ganglions, all innervate, as you can see, smooth muscles such as of the eye, the nasal glands, the glands, salivary glands, parotid salivary glands, visceral organs of the neck, thoracic cavity, and most of the abdominal cavity and other organs that are inferior in the abdominal pelvic organs, such as the uterus and other reproductive organs. The parasympathetic ganglion fibers that leave the brain predominate from cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, cranial nerve 7, and 10, the vagus nerve. They carry cranial parasympathetic output. Fibers will synapse at various ganglions. The vagus nerve, for predominant parasympathetic dominance, the vagus nerve alone provides about 75% of all parasympathetic outflow. I know that's a test question. About 75% of all parasympathetic outflow. Numerous branches of the vagus nerve intermingle in the preganglionic, postganglionic fibers. In other words, nerves will branch off from the point of synapse to different areas throughout the visceral organs, or the organs in the abdominal cavity. It also are fibers that will go to pelvic nerves and innervate such structures as the kidneys, the bladders, large intestines, and the sexual organs as well. Major effect, as we already talked about, if the sympathetic nervous system causes the eyes to dilate, it only makes sense that the parasympathetic would cause the eyes to constrict. We also see a decrease in heart rate. We also will see, you won't see sweating in this particular instance, and again you'll see increase in GI activity, increased production of digestive enzymes, increased digestive secretion, increased absorption, increased blood supply to digestion. The body itself, the somatic muscles, will go into a state of rest or repose. So we see the opposite effect of what we talked about with the parasympathetic nervous system. Secretion of hormones that produce the absorption and utilization of nutrients in peripheral cells, glands, secretions, gastric glands, duodenal glands, intestinal glands, pancreas, all will increase in their activity. Changes in blood flow from skeletal muscles or somatic muscles and glandular activity associated with sexual arousal, increase in smooth muscle activity in the digestive tract, stimulation and coordination of defecation and or urination, Contraction of urinary bladder, didn't know that was on there. Constriction of respiratory passageways. Again, just think about when you're running, you got to dilate. So sympathetic activity increases activity, the bronchial tubes will dilate. Parasympathetic effect, bronchial tubes will constrict. No need to run. Constriction of respiratory passageways. So reduction in heart rate, reduction in the force of contractility. If you've ever been scared and your heart was just pounding, that's sympathetic innervation. But now you have a reduction in heart rate, slows the force of contraction, sexual arousal and stimulation of sexual glands in both sexes. Functional center of relaxation, food processing, we already talked about. Parasympathetic neurons release acetylcholine. This is the primary neurotransmitter in this system. The neuromuscular and neuroglandular junction, the parasympathetic division, has a small, narrow synaptic. The effect of stimulation is short-lived. Most acetylcholine is released and activated by acetylcholinesterase. You're probably already familiar with that mechanism from the muscle system in first semester. Acetylcholine diffusion in surrounding tissue is inactivated by the enzyme cholinesterase, sometimes called pseudocholinesterase as well. But once the neurotransmitter is released, it's deactivated by the enzyme. Remember, we talked about acetylcholine last semester. Acetylcholine, immediately upon the release of acetylcholine, an enzyme, acetylcholinesterase, is secreted to break it down. As a result, the effect of parasympathetic stimulation is quite localized, only lasts for a few seconds at most. Now, there are receptors. Again, in the sympathetic nervous system, two receptors, real easy, alpha, beta. In the parasympathetic nervous system, where is the signal going to be received? From the nicotinic receptor and the muscarinic receptors. Now, although all the synapses, neuron to neuron, neuromuscular, neuroglandular junctions, neuron to effector, parasympathetic division uses the names transmitters, acetylcholine, two types of acetylcholine receptors, nicotinic and muscarinic receptors. Now, nicotinic receptors located on the surface of the ganglia on both the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of neuromuscular junction. Exposure to acetylcholine always causes excitation of the ganglionic neurons of muscle fibers, but the opening chemical gated chambers into postsynaptic membrane. That just means when the acetylcholine hits, remember certain gates open up. We talked about calcium gates opening up for the conduction of impulses to take place. Muscarinic receptors are located at a particular neuromuscular junction. Remember, things slow down, and I always say remember slow, remember cold. Cholinergic, neuromuscular, muscarinic receptors are located at cholinergic, neuromuscular, and neuroglandular junctions. In the parasympathetic division, muscarinic receptors, all receptors are G proteins. Stimulation produces longer lasting effect than does the stimulation of nicotinic receptors. Nicotinic receptors can bind to nicotine. And that's a toxin. Again, we pick that up from cigarette smoking. Muscarinic receptors are stimulated by muscarine, a toxin produced by some poisonous mushrooms. That's where the names are derived. These are the primary nerves. Cranial nerves involved 3, 7, 9, and 10, with the sacral segments of S2 and S4. Parasympathetic division innervates services by cranial nerves and organs in the thoracic and abdominal cavities. All parasympathetic neurons are cholinergic. All parasympathetic neurons are cholinergic. Muscarinic receptors at the neuromuscular and neuroglandular junctions produce either excitation or inhibition, depending on the nature of the enzyme activated by acetylcholine. The effects I already talked about before. What happens when we see parasympathetic innervation. The neurotransmitter that is here, the sympathetic division, was primarily norepinephrine, a neurotransmitter. Both norepinephrine and epinephrine hormones secreted from the adrenal medulla. In the parasympathetic division, we see the release of acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, at least the primary neurotransmitter. Now, there are other neurotransmitters that are involved in the system, but for parasympathetic neurotransmitter, we look for acetylcholine. For sympathetic, we look at epinephrine and norepinephrine. Again, that makes sense when we think about what adrenaline does, what epinephrine does, flight or fight. We would see norepinephrine, epinephrine in the sympathetic nervous system. Acetylcholine would be the one that we see in the parasympathetic division. Now, there's interactions between the two systems. Important to note. And remember, you saw the same organs when we looked at the sympathetic nervous system. You saw the same organs when we looked at the parasympathetic nervous system. So same organs are innervated. It's just the effect by that autonomic nervous system is a little bit different. Sympathetic division has widespread impact on organs and tissues throughout the body. Parasympathetic division innervates only visceral structures that are serviced by cranial nerves that lie within the abdominal pelvic cavity, the GI organs. Although some organs are innervated by just one division, most vital organs receive dual innervation. That's a test question, dual innervation. That means it's going to get instructions from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. Dual innervation. Dual innervation exists. The two divisions commonly have opposing effect. Dual innervation, opposing effects, is the most evident in the digestive tract, the heart, and the lungs. At other sites, we also see responses, but they're complementary responses typically when we talk about this process of dual innervation. We also see other particular areas, nerves that are involved. Parasympathetic fibers exist in other nerves as well. I won't go through the list. Sympathetic innervation releases structures that travel in other areas as well. And those are the two nervous systems, just an illustration again out of your book demonstrating to you the somatic response that you see from the somatic nervous system, where we have voluntary control and we tell skeletal muscles to move. And then you see the process which involves the hypothalamus when we think about the control of the autonomic nervous system and how its effects differ. Again, the visceral motor nuclei exist in the hypothalamus. When we look at the somatic nervous system, we see upper motor neurons in the primary motor cortex, which is inherently different from what we see in the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic nervous system functions on its own to be able to carry out particular functions. There are several plexuses in the autonomic nervous system that I will just review very quickly for you here. There is the cardiac plexus, the pulmonary plexus, the celiac plexus, and the superior and inferior mesenteric plexus, and the hypogastric plexus that exist with the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic fibers that enter the thoracic cavity intersect at the cardiac plexus, and the pulmonary plexus contains sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers bound for the heart, the lungs, respectively, as well as parasympathetic ganglion output organs. The esophageal plexus contains descending branches of the vagus nerve and the splanchnic nerve. Vagus nerve for parasympathetic, right, and splanchnic nerve for sympathetic, leaving the sympathetic chain on either side. The celiac plexus, also known as the solar plexus, you know its location because of the pain you can feel if you're struck in that area. Parasympathetic preganglionic fibers of the vagus nerve enter the abdominal pelvic cavity of the esophagus. The celiac plexus is associated with smaller plexuses, the inferior mesenteric plexus, which innervate some of the visceral abdominal muscles. Then there's a hypogastric plexus and a hypogastric plexus that also contains parasympathetic and sympathetic